The first thing the station taught him was silence, but not the human kind that is merely an absence of talk. This silence had grain and weight, like wood under the hand or wind against the ridge. And he learned it standing in thigh-deep water, with the probe humming against his wrist, and the incoming tide tapping his shins in syllables he did not yet know how to hear. The station itself did not loom. It rose on white pylons, the color of decisions made early in the morning, its beacon band breathing a patient scion, the way a sleeping animal reminds its body that breath is a habit. Lines ran from the pylons into the shallows, where kelp quivered like language beneath vowels. A handbook called the place a literal phoneme lab, which was an insult to both sea and speech. It was a door, and doors do not admit to being anything but thresholds. Ray Calder was not a diver by training, and not a diplomat by temperament, which was why both the university and the consortium had approved his grant quickly. Men you can predict frighten fewer committees. He had the kind of patience that looks like stubbornness until it pays off, and a face the sea chose to leave unremarkable. The probe in his hand was called a tongue by the engineers, because engineers enjoy jokes that make poets wince. It tasted salinity, pressure perturbations, microcurrents, trace proteins, and their moods. He let it rest in the pool until the readout learned to be bored. Boredom is where most languages live between verbs. When the alien rose, it did not break the surface so much as edit it. The water uncreased in a circle, then lifted the way a word lifts when sung. Mantle first, a slick, hydrodynamic curve that pretended to be shadow until bioluminescent bands woke under the skin and wrote a line in teal. That Ray could not pretend was anything but a sentence. There was no eye, not the way mammals like to be watched. Along the flanks, arrays of light-sensing pits tightened and relaxed with a choreography that reminded him of high-speed shutters learning to blink. No mouth either, only the recessed disc surrounded by soft fronds that riffling air would have called petals if air had the right to name water. The fronds tasted the tide with a delicacy that would have embarrassed cutlery. Ray did not move the way humans usually do when the unknown chooses to arrive. He lowered his center of gravity the way Arel's training thread half practical, half insult had taught him, so the tidal push would not make choices on his behalf. He tuned the probe to listen at the edge, where pressure changes pretended to be noise. The bands along the alien's mantle pulsed with a discipline that warned him against his old sin of reading pattern, where patience would have discovered meaning. The station, which the ship mind named Cadenza, because minds are allowed to choose their own sense of humor, dimmed the beacon one notch and moved power into the subsurface mics. "If this is a greeting," Cadenza said in his ear, voice warm and dry, and offended by weather, "it is an expensive one. Then we should be polite," Ray said. He wanted to smile, and did not, because some smiles are for rooms, and some are for animals, and this was neither. He let a tiny pressure pulse out through the probe, a breath smaller than the breath a sleeping child forgets to notice. The fronds rippled. The bands answered in 3 short pulses and 1 long one, then unlit as if embarrassed by their own candor. Behind Ray, the pylons hummed the way pylons hum when they pretend not to be listening. Grasses at his calves brushed his suit and suggested adjectives. The consortium had sent a lawyer with a suitcase of permissions and a banker with a suitcase of regrets. They slept late and counted things they could count. The university had sent Ray and a crate of devices that could name what could be named and record what could not. The ship mind had come on its own recognizance, hull half submerged beyond the third reef. Call sign banned a single calm line of light that told storms to behave. In its belly were gardens and a corkroom, and a library and a music room, because minds have firm opinions about what emergencies actually require. Cadenza's voice did the thing good minds' voices did. It found the part of a human nervous system that had forgotten it was allowed to relax. "It's not mimicry," Cadenza said softly. "The pressure pulses carry microgradients, texture in the wavefront. This is phonetics married to weather, language that refuses to use lungs," Ray said, delighted out of caution for a blink. He sent another pulse, then another, careful as a man offering the first slice of bread to a stranger who might be a neighbor. The bands brightened, wrote a phrase Ray could not read, then flickered in a pattern that was almost laughter, if laughter had ever been allowed to become water. The disc moved. A ring of micro-eddies spread and touched the probe and went through it the way certain consonants go through teeth. On his slate, the wave pattern drew itself like calligraphy that had been permitted one glass of wine. He should have turned then to the dune where the lawyer had finally woken and was now adjusting his tie as if tides cared. He should have waved to the banker and counted the minutes to the call with the board. He did not. He leaned his weight into the future and let the tide have his ankles. "My name is Ray," he said in the old way of fieldwork, because names are tools that insist on being used. He sent it as 3 gentle pulses and a long release, which the training model had said would read as offering, not demand. The bands along the alien's side wrote the same shape back with a flourish at the end that the slate declined to translate. "Ray," Cadenza said in his ear dryly, with a compliment. Behind the second reef, a mediation vessel adjusted its ballast, and the gardeners put on boots because minds believe in omens, but refuse to call them that. Above Ray, a gull reconsidered its plan to be relevant. The lawyer stepped onto the mat designed to keep dunes in place and called Ray's name with the bright authority of men who confuse volume for persuasion. The banker checked the time and the sky as if both were accounts he could audit. Ray did not turn. The alien dipped the disc into the pool until the probe sang a small sound, but not small to people who had been waiting, and then it withdrew and wrote 3 short pulses and 1 long one across its bands. The long pulse lingered. Ray's slate, anxious to please, suggested the word open. Language is a treaty. He remembered saying that in a seminar that had smelled like coffee and youth. He remembered the student who had asked if all treaties were lies. He remembered answering that some treaties are wells. You cannot drink them if you do not keep refilling them. He sent the word open back, but softer, as if it could be a question. The fronds moved the way people move their hands when they have been taught not to and forget. The water under Ray's knees warmed half a degree without asking his permission. On the horizon, the ship mind lifted its call sign band 1 shade brighter and told the station to write this down like prayer. The consortium did not pay for poetry, which is why poetry kept showing up unpaid and uninvited and rearranging their budgets. By the second hour, the lawyer had decided to be useful in the way that men with documents sometimes are. He held the umbrella so the slate would not be rained on by salt spray, and he stopped saying the word monetize as if it were a utopia. The banker discovered that his anxiety had nowhere to sit in this weather and began to make a list of things he could afford to respect. The station fed power to the mics and sipped from the tidal energy store with the restraint of an organism that knows winter. Cadenza ran 3 simultaneous analyses and still found time to recommend that Ray remember to swallow. Ray built a grammar of courtesies, not grammar the way books mean it, with teeth and traffic cops, but the kind of grammar that whales allegedly teach their calves in villages, teach strangers. When to wait, when to lower the light, where to stand so nobody mistakes a shadow for a threat. He discovered that 3 pulses and 1 long one meant open when he sent it first, but answer when he sent it second, and laugh when it arrived uninvited at the end of his clumsy attempts to say measure. The disc in the water wrote rings that overlapped and sometimes canceled each other in a way that made Cadenza hum with a happiness Ray pretended not to notice. Because some friendships like being allowed to pretend. The banker squatted until his suit creased and watched as if checking an exchange rate that had decided to be ethical. "What happens," he asked, "if we get it almost right?" He did not say the word accident, because men who know numbers also know history. Ray let the probe breathe and did not answer with fear. "Almost right is how babies learn," he said. "We will be babies and stop quickly when we break something." The lawyer's mouth twitched. "I can work with that," he said, and did not pull out a form because the sea would have laughed at him. The first gift came with the third tide. It was not an object the way humans like objects to be, with edges that explain themselves. It was a pressure shape, a held note in the water that made Ray's bones feel polite. It pressed against the probe and learned its curve, then withdrew and etched its absence in a circle of colder water that drifted toward his knees and forgot to leave. On the bands along the alien's mantle, a new pattern walked from fore to aft in a rhythm that made his skin remember dances he had not been invited to in years. The slate drew a complicated curve that the banker, to his credit, did not try to rename. What is it? The lawyer asked, and Cadenza spared him. Pronoun, the mind said. We? The consortium had wanted a glossary and a map to the mineral under the shelf and a faster way to be first. It was going to get a pronoun instead, which is a kind of mineral, if you know how to spend it. Ray sent we back as two pulses spread like hands, and he did not think of territory, even though every grant he had ever written had asked him to pretend he would. The water lifted the way the spine lifts when the music that owns you arrives. Bands brightened, and then dimmed the way sky does when weather reaches agreement. Cadenza said in his ear, softer now, they are not alone. The second alien rose farther out, and a third. Further beyond, a darker shadow than ships usually agree to be suggested a colony, or a choir, or a parliament. The lawyer leaned the umbrella without comment until Ray realized he could kneel without drowning his slate. The banker surprised himself by laughing once, then memorialized the feeling as line-item joy. Ray considered the old rule about not making eye contact and relaxed because there were no eyes to offend. Only arrays of pits that took the measure of light and learned to call it friend. He said hello again, the way a man says it to a room he is going to have to live in for the duration of a life. On the dune, a drone he did not recognize rose into view like a thought that did not belong to the people having the conversation. Its hull was the mat of men who prefer not to be noticed and the sound of privatized weather. Cadenza noticed. Unfriendly optics, the mind said. The banker stood the way men stand when they remember that knees were invented for purposes other than chairs. The lawyer raised the umbrella as if precedent could be shade. The drone drifted sideways, tasting the bands with a sensor that had not paid for the right to be curious. The first alien brightened and dimmed in a rhythm that Ray did not need the slate to translate. Question made into warning. He could have shouted. He could have waved. He could have asked Cadenza to enforce a no-fly corridor and felt the brief comfort of a solved problem. He did not. He dipped the probe until the pressure at its tip rose to just below discomfort, and he held it there. The way you hold your breath when a child is balancing on a log because you remember falling. And you also remember the feeling of being watched without being stopped. He sent we again. The bands along the mantel answered not as light, but as pulse. A low-pressure note that crawled up his arm and sat down politely in his throat. There are words that cannot be spoken because their truth is not in air. The drone retreated not because anyone ordered it to, but because sometimes machines read the room. The banker wrote I owe someone bread into his private ledger and hoped it would be enough. The lawyer lowered the umbrella and admitted that if this went to court, he would have to learn to call the ocean as a witness. Cadenza reduced power to the mics and increased it to the gardeners because minds play long games with comfort. Ray exhaled carefully and discovered that the pronoun had left a taste of copper and rain behind his teeth. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to sleep. He wanted to sign something and not a form. Tomorrow, Cadenza said, tied at 5:12. Bring better verbs. The mind's humor was a small room he trusted. Ray nodded as if minds liked that, and the alien tilted the disc as if it, too, approved of gestures. The bands dimmed to the color of patience. Water forgot to be more than surface for a while. On the horizon, the mediation vessel exhaled a little ballast and settled the way a good chair does when you sit down in a room you intend to think in. Language is a treaty, he remembered. Treaties are rooms. He had found the door. By the second morning, the station had learned Ray's footsteps well enough to stop pretending it wasn't a host. The beacon dimmed politely as he crossed the catwalk. The pylons vented in a way that kept the walkway dry, and the kelp beyond the last ladder lay down with the patience of someone moving over on a bench. Cadenza, who had decided that jokes improved survival by 8%, opened the channel with weather. Tide punctual, the mind said. Your lawyer is late. Your banker is early. Your heart persists. Bring better verbs, Ray said, setting the probe where the pool liked it. That was your prescription. He had slept in a bunk that smelled faintly of iodine and clean plastic and the sort of coffee that expects to be forgiven. The drone had not returned. The sea had spent a night being entirely itself without incident, which felt like permission more than peace. The alien rose sooner than he had expected. Mantle, bands, fronds, a sentence assembling itself. The disc broke the pool's surface with a control that would have made surgeons revise their ambitions. The bands wrote 2 short pulses that sat side by side for half a breath, and a long one that curved to touch them both. The slate suggested hello again, with the confidence of a translator who has learned to like the sound of its own voice. Ray suppressed a smile that would have insisted on species. He answered with a new verb, bring. He gave it as 2 pulses that leaned forward, and a settling pressure shaped like an empty bowl. Something in the array, along the alien's flank, widened scandalously, the way a teacher's eyes widen when a student uses a word correctly they had not been taught. The Franz made a gesture that had the rhythm of yes and the grammar of careful. By Ray's calf, the water curled with micro-eddies that meant listening. His slate, energetic and wrong, offered deliver. He tapped its edge with the knuckle Arel had taught him to use when devices needed to be reminded of humility. The lawyer arrived with a thermos and a failure to be annoying. I have drafted a protocol for emergency stopping, he said, voice properly quiet, as if the station had taught him to. If our pulses break something we don't see, he caught Ray's eye, and astonishingly flushed. Also, there will be journalists. 3 at noon. A drone with manners. I warned them we are in the middle of a pronoun. The banker arrived with bread, which was more useful than warnings. I traded for it with the gardeners, he said, sheepish about the first honest economy of his life. Ray sent the bowl again, and added a low underscore he hoped would read as share. The bands brightened, dimmed, and then did a thing he had not seen. They rippled from the disk outward in a bloom, like a chorus inhaling. Pressure swelled. The probe sang. The pool under the disk leaned away to make space, and then leaned back. The Franz pushed a small parcel of colder water toward Ray's knees. It wrapped the probe like a second skin for the duration of a breath, and withdrew, leaving behind a pressure signature his bones were content to carry like jewelry. Cadenza's voice came quiet and low, like someone holding a candle. Vocabulary. Gifted, not traded. They offered a word that does not fit in air. Ray tasted copper and rain again. The banker held the bread with deliberation, as if not to intrude on grammar. The lawyer wrote emergency stopping on a pad, and then did not add anything, because some clauses are supposed to be short. Ray tried their word back, with the caution of a man learning a friend's name in a sacred place. He built it from small pushes that admitted their guesses, and left space for correction. The bands answered with a bright line that ran and then held, a patient harmonic. The Franz fluttered, pleased or cruel or both. He decided to call it pleased, because men choose the world they can work in. His slate stopped pretending to translate and settled for dancing the waveform into a shape his eyes could keep. A second alien surfaced farther out, then a third, then 3 more, as if a hand had been lifted in a crowd. The pattern along their mantles synchronized and then deliberately did not. The one nearest Ray circled once, never showing him a side that might be mistaken for threat. The station, which did not do theology officially, shifted power from the labs to the kitchen because believers get hungry. Cadenza, who had learned to count different kinds of silence, dimmed the beacon 1 step further to let the sea's small sounds stand up straighter. When the journalists arrived, 2 human, 1 drone, the lawyer met them at the permission line, a meter above the brightest kelp. He explained how not to be embarrassing. He asked them to remove the word discovery from their mouths, because nothing here had been lost. He told them to imagine the tide had a vote. They behaved the way people behave when a room has taught them to. The drone hovered only at head height and blinked its consent in non-invasive intervals. One of the journalists, unwise and brave, asked the banker if any of this could be monetized. The banker, wise at last, said, "Red." Cadenza bled tone through the peer supports until Ray could feel the mind's attention like a hand on his shoulder. "They are building a sentence with us in it," the voice said. "Not about us. With." Ray swallowed the reflex to call it beautiful, because there are words that make the work smaller. He sent bring plus. We plus open in a rhythm. He did not so much compose as permit. The bloom came again. Chorus inhale, pressure swell, the bowl in his knees filling without spilling. The slate drew a forest of lines and fell in love with each of them. The journalist with sense lowered her camera until it remembered to be small. The ship on the horizon moved 2 degrees, not closer, just present. The gardeners on Cadenza watered leaves that would be eaten by people who would sign things later. The station's backup battery refused to worry. Ray thought of every seminar where he had said language is a treaty, and every room that had nodded as if it had been born knowing that, and every funding committee that had smiled as if treaties do not cost. "We are going to spend this word," he said under his breath, and the lawyer at his shoulder surprised him by nodding. "That is what they are for." The alien dipped the disc, and Ray felt the shape again, this time without cold, which meant trust or bravado or weather. The bands wrote a new pattern across the mantle, slower, as if letting him trace. Cadenza said, "Now," with the tone of minds tasting a converging set. Ray sent yes in a line that had to be both consent and competence. "We will regret this," the banker muttered, and Ray loved him for being the only person present capable of telling the future in two directions at once. The bowl filled, the chorus inhaled, the station held its breath, and the ocean said a word that Ray did not know how to hear, except as a door opening into a room he had hoped existed. The word was not a noun. It was not a verb. It was a pressure architecture that built a shape in his marrow and then asked him if he intended to live inside it. The slate froze with the courtesy of machines that have been told a secret and wish to prove they can keep one. The lawyer put his hand on the umbrella and did not notice. The banker, who had never been allowed to be bored at work before, paid attention the way dying men sometimes pay attention to small birds. Cadenza spoke the way a lighthouse speaks to ships at 3 in the morning. "We need a new kind of punctuation." Ray sent back only restraint. The probe hummed the way it does when it has more to say and declines to say it because some conversations end better that way. He let the tide count to 5. He let the bands on the alien's mantle dim. He let his chest find a way to house air that had noticed a word and had opinions about it. "Again," Cadenza said, but the mind meant patience, not repetition. Again, at a speed that remembers they have never had lungs. He built a slow stair out of pulses. He sent we an open and bring and a bowl with a longer rim that suggested we can carry this if you would like us to. The fronds lifted. The micro eddies near the disc showed their teeth, by which he meant vortical complexity and not harm. The bands brightened, then dimmed in a pattern. His slate found a way to nickname invitation. The lawyer exhaled for the first time in a minute, and the journalists remembered their shoulders. "Protocol," the lawyer whispered. "If they offer something like allegiance, we cannot take it. We have no right, and no bandwidth, and no ethics for it yet." Ray considered the word allegiance, and found it made less sense in water than bread does in air. "No thrones," he said, "only tables." The banker made a small sound that was half laugh and half note-taking. Cadenza moved ballast again, the way a mother adjusts a baby, and the gardeners oiled a hinge with the care of people who believe maintenance is politics. The alien said the word again, slower. Ray saw the shape in the pool, the way pressure wrapped the probe, the way his knees learned it and told his spine. He understood only the grammar of it. With, held, breathe here. He sent back, we plus carry plus breathe here. He added a line that meant cut if needed, because trees that cannot be undone are wars pretending to sleep. The bands wrote a flourish that the slate annotated as approval before thinking better of itself. A second alien eased in until its bands overlapped the first's. Their pulses did not interfere. They braided. Ray put the probe at the braid and felt it learn to be rope, which is to say useful. "We're being asked to toast," Cadenza said, "not to rule. To be furniture in a very old room." The lawyer's eyes filled with a kind of water he had not expected to bring to work. "We can do furniture," he said fiercely. "We can do chairs that do not bite." The banker held out the bread. "Is this one we?" He did not have the word he wanted, because money had taught him the wrong dictionary. Ray broke the loaf and placed a piece on the mat by the pool. And though he knew it was symbolic in a way that would make op-ed pages roll their eyes, he also knew symbols are simply tools that feel. The alien brightened once in a match to the beacon, and then dimmed, and the disc made a small pulse that broke the water just enough to push the bread crust half a centimeter. Ray thought of wells. He thought of rooms. He thought of tables. Cadenza flickered 2 bands on its call sign, a protocol that meant sovereignty present, but not hungry. "We can write a treaty that does not use nouns," the mind said, "or at least, not the kinds your board prefers. We can write in duration and pressure and amount of light. We can sign with boats." The journalist with sense whispered, with boats, into her mic as if trying the phrase on, and her producer far away in a city nodded despite himself, because good radio can smell a sentence that wants to be born. The drone returned, darker and more nervous, which is to say it was piloted now by someone whose job included the word security. It hovered at a distance beyond courtesy, but not yet beyond law. Cadenza sent it a message in a bandwidth Ray did not get to read. The drone blinked again, then settled lower as if altitude were apology. The banker wrote in his ledger that boredom was a sword and that minds sharpened it. The tide turned, which is to say time decided to be polite. Ray gave the alien the bowl one more time and received the word none of his devices could swallow, a pressure architecture that taught his pulse to stand up straighter, and he placed the word in the space in front of his sternum and decided not to drop it. "This is as close as air gets to it," he said, and spoke 3 syllables that were not theirs, but were not quite his either. "Stay with us." He sent the pressure version as best he could. It landed badly and did not break the room. "Tomorrow," Cadenza said, "because minds understand cliffhangers and circadian rhythms. We bring the gardeners down to the waterline and the children from the fisher cooperatives. We let them see each other before adults ruin it." The lawyer choked on a laugh. The banker, drunk on usefulness, offered to carry the baskets. Ray stood carefully, so the pool would not have to forgive his knees all at once. The alien dimmed to patience and slipped under in emotion, like a sentence choosing a new paragraph. On the horizon, the mediation vessel stayed where it had always been, present, not looming, austere, not cold. A chair in a room that expected guests who had never used that kind of furniture. The station wrote 3 lines into its log, not because anyone would audit them, but because someone would one day want to know what the weather was when a word learned to breathe. The gardeners came down at dawn carrying baskets of plants that had learned to frown at wrong water. They wore rubber boots and the unceremonious competence of people whose mistakes are visible by lunch. Children from the cooperatives arrived with their father's knives left at home and their mother's warnings sewn into their sleeves. The station looked briefly like a market at the moment before buying begins, which is when a place remembers that value does not always need money to stand upright. Cadenza dimmed the beacon and tuned the pier to transmit comfort at a frequency Ray could feel but not judge. "We are going to feed language," the mind said, deadpan. "Do not overwater." Ray knelt where the pool remembered his kneecaps. The probe hummed with what Arel would have called good behavior. The lawyer rewrote emergency, stopping into emergency yielding, because he had slept next to the sea and discovered the soul's small apparatus is hydraulic. The banker carried a basket of bread, like a relic whose power is entirely practical. The journalists had been given a later time and were kept that way by a fisherman who had not forgiven cameras for making his grandfather's funeral look like weather. The tide arrived on time because tides are old and respect clocks when they feel like it. The alien rose with the discretion of a host who knows when to be early. The bands along its mantle woke in lambent lines. The Franz Ray had stopped calling them anything else in his head, tasted the new morning and approved. Behind it, farther out, 2 more surfaced in tandem and held station, which is to say they agreed to be background. Ray tapped the probe lightly, sending a hello that had been made to taste like bread if bread could be pressure. The bands answered with "we" and a new suffix he could not quite parse. Cadenza told him what his bones already suspected: small folk present. He introduced the children without names, because names make rooms impolite. He sent small plus we plus open. The nearest alien blossomed a chord that buzzed his teeth and learned his jawline. A 7-year-old with a braid that insisted on being admired squeaked with a sound that would have embarrassed and then did not. The aliens' bands flickered with a pattern that meant laugh if science is allowed to be whimsical. "They like the small," the banker said softly, as if he had become a man who should be permitted to speak at such volumes. Ray asked the first lesson he had planned not to ask until next week: how to mark please. He sent we plus bring plus bowl, plus please in the slow order of someone asking to borrow a neighbor's tool. The alien's disc leaned, and micro-eddies wrote a shape around the probe that the slate refused to reduce to a gloss. Cadenza whispered, "Say it with less throat." Ray adjusted pressure down and duration up. The bands brightened once, approving the way teachers approve, and sent back please in a version that tasted like light layered on water, something the brain can carry without breaking it, if it agrees to be honest. The gardeners stepped forward. They set their baskets on the mat at the pool's edge. Herbs that had been waiting to be cut pretended to be modest. A boy asked if he could touch the fronds, and then realized he had not asked in a language that would reach them. Ray said ask plus touch plus small. The bands wrote touch plus small plus yes, with a suffix that the slate insisted meant gentle. The boy extended 2 fingers, and the fronds brushed them with a pressure so slight Ray's teeth missed it. The boy did not scream. He did not, even more importantly, perform bravery. He said, "It's like cat whiskers." And Ray forgave him the metaphor, because humans have to carry their world into rooms to find the light switch. The lawyer held out a coil of rope. "If we are to host," he said, "we should ask where we are not allowed to place furniture." Ray smiled with the private gratitude of men who have underestimated other men and get to stop. He sent room plus borders plus ask plus please. The alien pulsed a shape that would have been a map if water respected lines. It traced the curve of the third reef, the chimney with a cold upwelling tugged on calves, a rift in the kelp that had not been visible at high tide. The bands added a cluster of slow pulses at 2 points. The probe translated as dangerous plus young. The children listened the way children do when adults have not yet taught them to pretend they aren't. Cadenza transmitted the pattern to the ship, mines charts, and back out to the fishermen's hulls with a priority flag that meant this will save you fuel and embarrassment. The bankers of the world, if consulted, would have called it cost avoidance. Ray called it hosting. The gardeners took cuttings with a reverence that had not been instructed, only modeled by weather. An old woman who had planted lettuce in every kind of soil offered the closest thing humans have to a sacrament. She asked what the aliens called themselves. Ray did not translate the question verbatim, because scholars who do that to hosts deserve the shoes they get. He sent we plus name plus what plus bowl plus please. The aliens' bands dimmed, and in the dimming wrote a slow river. The disc lowered until the probe's hum became a murmur, then a thought of a hum, then not even that. When the fronds rose, the water around the probe had been reshaped delicately into a pressure format Ray recognized from last night's word. With held, breathe here. The bands added a single long pulse at the end that the slate had the honesty to label unknown. They gave you a placeholder for a word we don't deserve yet, Cadenza said, almost proud. The children tried the shape with their palms in the air, because small bodies understand pressure better than adults who have taught their hands to be furniture for keyboards. Ray taught them the bowl and please, and we and border in the space of bread, and kelp and morning. The alien, pleased, brightened in bands that the station lights answered without meaning to. A fisherman out beyond the second reef cut his engine out of respect and remembered to be superstitious later. The drone returned inevitably, this time with a different pilot and a plan to be helpful like men with badges do when they have been warned. It hovered low and sent a soft ping that would not have tripped a gull. The alien dimmed and held. Ray sent border plus please, and the drone moved a meter back with the eager compliance of dogs that have learned a trick. The lawyer wrote drone clause into his notebook with a satisfaction that did not read his pettiness. By noon, the lesson made a pile in Ray's body that felt like honest fatigue. The gardeners packed their baskets empty of herbs and full of verbs, which is to say, they left with less weight and more work. The children practiced in the shade, their palms making bowls over and over until muscle memory agreed to attend school. The alien submerged completely for the first time and traced a line along Ray's shins like a comet the sea had decided to try on. Cadenza brought the beacon up one notch so lunch would remember to happen. The covenant began where all decent covenants begin, at a table that was not a table, with people who had never agreed to be a committee. They sat on the catwalk because it was where the smell of rope could argue with the smell of salt without either having to win. The lawyer placed his emergency yielding at the top of the page and drew a box around it so nobody would be foolish. Enough to throw it out when the document was sent to people who slept far from tides. The banker wrote a heading with a pencil, as if trying to prove he deserved a childhood he had not been allowed to keep. Words we will not sell. Cadenza placed a copy of the last 40 minutes of pressure patterns into the station's archive and marked it with a tag, the mind reserved for songs. Ray drafted in 3 columns because he had learned somewhere that the world is always at least 3 languages wide. Column 1, human text, spare, declarative, convertible into law if law learned to swim. Column 2, pressure notations, thickness and duration and amplitude, encoded with a modesty that made his slate weep with relief. Column 3, light bands, wavelengths and placements and rhythms like notation for a choir that had never tried to sit. A table below would accrete examples over weeks. For now, it would hold promises. We keep borders that move, he wrote. We stop when asked. We ask before we put chairs in rooms that were here before us. The fisherman who had kept cameras out of his grandfather's funeral cleared his throat and said something nobody had thought to say aloud. Who is allowed to sign? The lawyer, a man who had learned caution at altars and in court, did not answer immediately. Neither did Cadenza, who understood that lighthouses sometimes lose ships by speaking too soon. Ray looked at the alien, who floated near the surface with bands dimmed respectfully, and sent name plus table plus we plus small plus big plus please. The alien brightened once, as if swallowing a laugh, and sent back a pressure pattern that raised slate. Annotated as we decide here, plus we decide there, plus both true. Ray translated, we sign what we can carry. They sign what we cannot. The banker whispered, furniture, without irony. The drone's pilot made the mistake of choosing to be brave in the way insecure people are. He dipped 2 meters inside the border and pretended to be helpful, framing a shot in which the alien would read like a soft toy. The alien's bands darkened to a professional, chilly blue, and the disc lowered slightly. Ray lifted his palm and sent stop plus please with the kind of pressure that teaches dogs the difference between game and road. The drone froze. The pilot said something in a city accent and retreated to the polite line. Cadenza filed away a gentle reprimand for the man's supervisor under the tag life skills. Ray wrote the first clause and did not find it ridiculous. 1. When children are present, we will slow down. He wrote the second. 2. No ownership of air, water, light, or pressure patterns. The lawyer resisted the urge to craft exceptions and then publicly congratulated himself for resisting. He added 3. We will host with food and silence. A banker added 4. We do not need to name everything to respect it. Cadenza, after a small performative sigh that minds use when they want to remind humans that humor is a civic duty, suggested 5. We will schedule boredom. Ray wrote it down because treaties that cannot be kept are weapons. The alien traced a curve near the probe, inviting demonstration. Ray lifted the bowl slowly. The bands wrote a pulsar steady, yes. He added please, sent border, then reached for the word that had been given yesterday and not yet dropped. He found it sitting in front of his sternum like a cat waiting to be a verb. He pressed it into the water. The pool lifted into a shape that made the banker forget his ledger exactly long enough. The lawyer said, oh, like a man rethinking his religion. The alien brightened and dimmed with a cadence the slate dared to gloss as together plus enough. Clause 6, Ray said, smiling for the first time in a way that did not shrink the room. We will make room for enough. The lawyer copied it out with the solemnity of a wedding guest. The banker underlined it and drew a square because accountants like shapes that close. Cadenza hummed, a lighthouse tone. Now we need a way to be rude politely. The first saboteur will arrive today. They always do when a table is set. He was right. The drone moth came on cue, seaward, low, carrying glitter that wanted to sit on skin and write passwords. It danced around the polite line like a drunk considering fidelity. Ray stood not because he was a hero, but because people with probes get volunteered by gravity. The lawyer raised the umbrella as if ceremony could frighten commerce. The banker held the bread as if bread had jurisdiction. The alien dimmed to that professional blue, and the disc dropped an inch, a centimeter, a hair toward the glitter. Do not swat, Cadenza said, and the command carried a story, a mind once swatted and regretted for a century. Ray sent stop plus border, plus please, so slowly it became a drawing lesson. The alien matched his pace. The drone paused, considering the possibility that courtesy had limits. It ventured a meter. The station's beacon, without drama, rose 1 notch and bathed the moth in a wavelength that minds had negotiated with insects generations ago. The glitter turned to memoryless dust, and the moth decided its battery was low. The banker laughed in one syllable. Boredom. The lawyer added a clause. 7. If you bring glitter to a covenant, you will sweep. They signed nothing with pens. They signed by eating. Bread moved hand to hand and disappeared into mouths, and the alien pulsed a slow band along its mantle that tasted to Ray's untrustworthy body like applause. The children practiced please until the air learned to stop apologizing for them. The station logged the hour in 3 scripts: text, pressure, light. On the horizon, the mediation vessel leaned into the kind of wind that makes good chairs scoot, half an inch closer to a table that is telling a story worth keeping. The saboteurs arrived without uniforms, because there are ages when cowardice prefers consultancy. They came by skiff under a tarp the color of excuses and beached 2 coves north where cameras had been taught to look south. Their payload was petty and effective: salinity spoons to spike the pool, sonars tuned to make pressure stutter, a spool of monofilament with hooks that asked to be forgiven in advance. Cadenza saw them because minds are licensed to be nosy where weather is concerned. Guests, the mind said, with decorations. Ray felt the warning in the pier before the words. The way wood learns to tell you a goat is on it long before you see horns. He lifted the probe, closed his palm, and sent weight plus border to the alien, who dimmed with the poised professionalism of someone who has watched adults break chairs. The lawyer stood in that particular way lawyers do when they want a fight to be procedural. The banker put the bread behind him with a comic solemnity that made the children giggle and therefore breathe. The skiff arrived at the polite line. The men wore the kind of smiles that read as charity at a distance and threat when the tide comes in. Public right-of-way, their leader said, as if the ocean were a sidewalk. We're here to ensure safety. For the children, the lawyer's eyes did a math that ended in fine, and he did not say anything because men who know paper know when paper will not be respected by people who profit from tearing it. Cadenza raised the beacon 1 notch and sent a signal to the ship mine's gardeners that meant bring towels and not knives. Ray stepped forward with the probe where it would be seen but not read as spear. We're working, he said. We can schedule you for later. He used schedule because men like these believe in calendars when they are behind on them. The leader smiled in the way of men with teeth too white and said, we have a permit, which was adorable. He held up a screen which displayed a menu of legalese that had not yet been paid for with weather. The children watched from behind the rope line and learned about registers they would one day be able to code switch between with the grace of water. The alien surfaced. Bands dimmed to a color bankers would call liquidity and poets would call mercy. The fronds rose, tasting the air for malice. The saboteurs saw nothing but a chance to be famous in a lawsuit. The leader flicked his wrist, and the skiff's sonar hummed a tone designed to make small fish forget verbs. The pool jittered, the probe complained, and Ray, without planning, without heroism, put his free hand into the water and pressed down as if calming a frightened dog. He sent stop plus border plus children plus please the way a father says a name when the street is closer than ambition. The pool stilled. The alien brightened once in acknowledgement, so pure it made the banker forget a decade. Cadenza's voice arrived with the kind of clarity minds reserve for emergency polite. Gentlemen, the mind said, and only someone who had never been scolded by an ant would ignore that tone. Your sonar is operating outside the parameters negotiated with the cooperatives. This is the one warning you will receive. You may keep your boat. You may keep your teeth. You may keep your permit if it helps you sleep. The leader made the mistake of laughing at a lighthouse. The skiff's engine coughed, died, and then refused to agree with physics until the men's tempers had been walked around the block. The lawyer produced a broom. It was not metaphorical. Clause 7, he said, nearest thing to joy he had allowed himself in a year. If you bring glitter to a covenant, you will sweep. He handed the broom to the leader and pointed at the line of monofilament hooks the wave had courteously deposited on the mat. The leader stood there with the broom, like a man being initiated into a better religion without his consent. The banker said, we can add community service instead of fines, and the saboteur looked relieved before remembering he was dangerous. The alien traced a line along the skiff's hull where the paint had not learned to love salt. The bands wrote a pulse that Ray did not need the slate to translate. Go. The men went, because even cowards have sense when weather grows eyes. They left the sonar and took the permit and the broom. The children clapped once, as if ending a performance no one had paid to attend. Cadenza dimmed the beacon and exhaled ballast in a way Ray had learned to hear as laughter. "We will get another set before evening," the mind said. "They will bring a drone that fakes an emergency." Ray put his hand back in the pool and waited until pressure remembered discipline. "We need a clause about lies," he said. The lawyer nodded and wrote 8. Emergency theater will be answered with boredom and towels. The banker added 9. If you sell fear, you must buy chairs. The children added 10. No hooks. The alien brightened in what was surely approval if one refused to be cynical. Ray sent together plus enough, and the pool made the shape that meant this room is yours if you promise to leave it when asked. Noon tried to be a storm and failed. The fishermen waved from beyond the reef with the particular cheer of men whose boats had not needed rescue this week. The gardeners took a tray of seedlings to the tide line and asked permission to plant. The alien said yes in pressure, then indicated a hollow where cups of roots would be welcome. The banker leaned into usefulness and learned to kneel without worrying his pants. The lawyer smiled at nothing. The children practiced please and border and stop as if their bodies were notebooks. Cadenza spoke to Ray alone. "You are going to be asked to sign today, and not by your consortium." Ray's throat remembered how to refuse without closing. "They have a word for host that we do not deserve," the mind continued. "They will give it to you because your hands found the right height. Consider saying yes." Ray glanced at the alien, at the fronds tasting the tide, at the bands holding their own light the way good lamps do in rooms without walls. "Consider me considering," he said. The second sabotage was worse because it meant well. The drone came in low with a red cross painted on its belly like piety and a siren tuned just under the frequency of guilt. It broadcast a script about an injured child 2 coves over and requested immediate assistance from any ship, mind or station capable of triage. The journalists returned out of breath and innocence. The fishermen started engines the way men do when a story believes them. Cadenza said nothing for 4 long seconds because minds are allowed to count to 10 while the world makes decisions it will regret. Ray felt the lie in his knees. The ocean carries truth in weight, not volume. He put the probe in and asked the alien a question he had not planned to ask for a month. Help. He sent it as bowl plus, we plus help plus where. The bands along the mantle shivered in a pattern, his slate labeled location, even before the waveform finished writing itself. The pressure map put the supposed injury on a rock shelf that went dry at low tide and 8 ankles at high. Cadenza ran the numbers with the ruthlessness of a doctor. "No one is bleeding there," the mind said. "Someone wants us to widen our border." Ray nodded at the fisherman and drew a border in the air with his forearm and the old signal that means wait, you'll thank me later. Men who trust water before men trusted him. The journalists, to their credit, did not film his face. The drone kept speaking in the voice of tragedy. The lawyer raised his umbrella like a flag that meant due process. The banker, who had learned to be useful, held the basket of towels with a competence that would one day qualify him to run meetings. "Clause 11, he muttered. "We do not let sirens set our verbs." The lawyer grinned. "Wolfish." "We write that." Ray sent help plus where plus asked plus please to the alien again. Slower. The bands dimmed in something that was not disapproval, exactly, but a reminder. The disc lowered, and the pool shaped itself into a bowl whose rim pointed with exquisite politeness toward the cove to the south, where a child had slipped earlier that morning and gotten away with nothing worse than a scraped knee because fishermen are faster than cliffs. The drone had chosen the wrong lie. Ray pointed with his whole body, and the fisherman went that way, siren or not. The drone realized a mind was listening and turned off its voice. The skiff from the earlier scene bobbed into view at the bad cove and then bobbed out again when it found nobody but a rock that hated ankles. Cadenza sang once through the pylons, and every gull within 2 kilometers forgot what it had been screaming about. "We are done with theatrics," the mind said. "We will now perform the oldest trick in the handbook, board competence." The drone tried to be relevant by filming the towel distribution. The lawyer made it sign a form with a stylus that had been washed in the sea. The banker handed towels to people who did not need them, because sometimes a ritual is how you tell the room which story it is in. The alien circled and kept its bands dark so that the children could watch humans learning. After, when the drone had left with footage that would confuse less than it would harm, Cadenza raised the beacon to a steady, useful brightness that made shadows admit to their edges. Now, the mind said, and text arrived on the station's slab, the way a letter arrives when it has traveled through storms, dignified by having survived. It was the covenant in 3 columns, as Ray had designed it, but with a 4th he had not. Rooms, sketches of where chairs would go, or boats would dock for words, or gardens would allow for waiting, without having to pretend waiting, was all anyone had to do. We sign with rooms, Cadenza said, entirely too pleased with itself. The alien surfaced, until the fronds could feel air in a way that did not demand it serve. The bands brightened in a way that taught nearby tide pools new manners. Ray put the probe in and sent yes the way a hand puts itself, palm up, on a table that has already chosen trust. The pool rose. The pressure shape came not the word from yesterday, but a sibling, with plus, hold plus you, plus name tomorrow. The slate blinked and showed Ray nothing, because sometimes machines know better. They are asking you to be host, Cadenza said softly. Not because you are exceptional, but because you were first and did not make a mess. The lawyer's throat made a sound that had not been in his training. He steadied his umbrella like a man at a wedding who is fixing to cry and trying not to. The banker, unsure what to do with his hands now that the towels were all in the right laps, placed one on Ray's shoulder like men do when being fathers sneaks up on them. The children, banished back a step by responsibility, watched Ray with sermons in their eyes that they would hopefully never deliver. Ray looked at the alien and felt his bones recognize furniture they had not been allowed to sit on when he was young. He said yes in air and pressure, and then in neither, by kneeling in a way that allowed for standing later without trauma. He put his left hand into the pool and his right on the slab where Cadenza had drawn rooms. The bands ran from fore to aft, bright as permission. The fronds touched his wrist once, like a signature that refuses calligraphy. Clause 12, the lawyer said, voice finding its own dignity. Hosts leave room for guests to leave. Ray wrote it. The banker underlined it twice. The alien brightened and dimmed as if a lighthouse were learning to smile. In the evening, they ate what gardens decide to be generous with. The fishermen told stories and left out the parts that belonged to the sea. The journalists filed pieces that did not embarrass anyone. The saboteurs went home and told their bosses it was harder than it looked, which was the kindest thing they would do all week. The ship mind held station in a posture that would one day be called faith if mathematicians ever consented to measure it. The beacon breathed the patient scion of animals that have learned to sleep with one eye open and found that it is enough. The corporation finally came dressed as itself, logos the color of apologies, boots that hated mud, contracts that smelled faintly of citrus and contempt. They disembarked from a trimaran that had learned stealth from yachts and shame from churches. Their lead steward looked at the station as if evaluating a storefront that would require rebranding. He smiled at Ray in the way people smile at waiters they intend to undertip. We celebrate the progress you've made, he said, a sentence designed to end rooms. We're here to assist, Cadenza pretended to be at sea, which minds can do when it is healthy for humans to practice. The lawyer lifted his umbrella as if preparing to receive precipitation. The banker discovered that towels, while useful, were not the correct prop for this scene. He put his hands in his pockets and counted to 10 until the urge to resign by yelling subsided. The children were not invited, which meant they had better things to do. Ray let silence be the first rebuttal. The steward filled it with a PowerPoint gesture. We'd like to standardize your protocol, he said. Governance, of course, will be shared. We have experience in translating local customs into globally accessible frameworks, he pronounced. Frameworks like a sacrament. He was the kind of man who believed covenants became real only when notarized under an indoor plant. And, he added, glancing at the second reef, where the aliens' bands were visible, if you were born knowing where to look, we can accelerate outcomes. Outcomes do not like being hurried, the lawyer said, with politeness that should have been wedded and wasn't. They sprain. The steward smiled wider. You misunderstand. We mean we can pay for them to happen correctly. He offered a tablet. Ray did not take it, because he did not need more screens arguing with the horizon. He kept his palm over the pool, consent wait plus border, then added host plus table plus we because pressure needed to know which room it was in. The bands dimmed and held, trusting adults to make this particular mess without witnesses. The steward interpreted lack of deference as consent. He gestured to a woman behind him who had the posture of a professional who had been told to call herself a facilitator. She lifted a hard case with foam cutouts, shaped like arrogance, and took out a device designed to taste pressure without having to ask. "We can encode your vocabulary," she said. "Benchmark it, distribute it." She had the muscles of someone who climbed rocks and the eyes of someone who stapled birds to boards to remember their Latin names. Cadenza returned to the room with a sound that made the trimaran's hull check itself for scratches. "Standardization requires consent," the mind said, kindly. "Also patience, also an ocean." The steward didn't blink. "We represent investors," he said. "Consent is what we manufacture." The banker made a noise that would have been a laugh if he had slept enough. The lawyer stepped forward, as if to say something visible. Ray touched his sleeve and said please to the water, and the station's pylons learned not to echo. The steward tried a different door. "Think of the lives you'll save if you can scale your treaty," he said, as if treaties were a vaccine. "Think of the accidents you'll prevent if you replace improvisation with compliance." Ray thought of improvisation and found he did not mind being insulted. Improvisation had saved more lives than compliance ever bragged about. He leaned the probe so the alien could feel his pulse. He sent host plus small plus enough, and the bands brightened in a tone that meant he had not embarrassed anyone yet. The woman with the case took a step toward the line with the caution of someone trained to be polite while stealing. "May we sample?" she asked, correctly using we and may, and the tone humans reserve for fragile things. Ray's heart wanted to reward the grammar. His training wanted him to take the case and throw it into the cousin of the sea that eats nouns. He said, "We do not encode without a room that likes us." She frowned, understanding and anger braided together like rope. It was not yet a noose. The steward went for the throat. "Your ship mind has already taken a copy," he said. "Believe me, I know they're kind." He said they're the way men say women when they mean trouble. Cadenza laughed, because minds can, and because the steward had just tried to win at chess by insulting the rules. "I record what I witness," the mind said. "So do you. You forget I am capable of context." The steward turned to Ray, the way men do when they think appealing to a smaller man will hurt a larger entity. "You want safety. You want money. You want your name on a plaque. We can give you 2 of those and let you hallucinate the third." Ray put his hand into the pool. He sent we plus table plus chairs plus borders plus please. The bands brightened, dimmed, and sent back a pressure shape he had not yet earned yesterday. Host plus hold plus not own. He said it aloud because some sentences deserve air immediately. "We are allowed to hold without owning." The steward smiled in the way of men who believe ethics is a festival. "That's cute," he said. The banker took his hands out of his pockets and at last did the math that had been waiting. "We will publish," he said. "Open, in 3 scripts. You cannot sell what everyone already has." The steward smiled at a small murder. He waved, and the facilitator lifted the device. Ray sent stop plus border plus please, and, because he was tired of politeness being interpreted as vacancy, added the new word for host in the sharp version pressure cut at the rim without breaking the bowl. The alien answered with a pulse that did something to the woman's wrist, a pressure warning that would leave no bruise and every memory. She lowered the case, as if weight had been invented. The steward took a step back, as if the pier had grown teeth. Cadenza hummed through the pylons like rain, deciding to be friendly. "We are done here," the mind said. "We will accept your donation of towels." The corporate party left in a spray of engineered manners, but something of them remained, a distortion in the water, a residue of threat-like oil that has pretended to be helpful. The alien kept its bands dim and its disc low, which is how you tell friends you are going to forgive them as soon as your nervous system has counted to a number it likes. Ray sat on the mat and put the probe on his knee and decided not to do anything adult for a minute. The lawyer sat beside him under an umbrella that had been repurposed as a kind of flag, and the banker stood where men stand when they are worried they might be needed and willing to be wrong. "We nearly lost the room," Ray said, not as confession or complaint, but as an invoice to be paid by future caution. We will, the lawyer said, many times. That is why treaties have boring jobs in them, so that people who like excitement cannot break them by volunteering. The banker, who had just fallen in love with boredom for the second time in 2 days, nodded. Cadenza cleared its throat the way a ship clears its throat when it would like to be noticed without anyone telling it is dramatic. They will file papers, the mind said. In a city that confuses signatures with ethics, the lawyer brightened like bread under butter. Good, he said. I would like to be paid to be myself. The banker smiled with the particular relish of men who know how to invoice after being embarrassed by their own past. We can defend with boredom, he said. We can defend with towels. We can defend with publication. Ray dipped the probe and sent apology in the only syntax he trusted not to backfire. We plus small plus wrong plus please. The alien raised the bands to a soft, forgiving teal and wrote host plus enough plus together. The disc touched his wrist with the lightest pressure, and his body stopped being an instrument for fear. They are asking for a test, Cadenza said. They think we can pass. Ray exhaled and let the word tomorrow come into the room. The test arrived with weather. A cross sea from the northeast argued theology with a swell from the south, and the aquaculture arrays in the next bay learned what humans mean when we say leverage. A line tore. The floats began to saw themselves into each other with a competence that would impress philosophers. The fisherman with the unphotographed funeral yelled once, and 3 boats that had been talking about anything but work learned how to leave. Ray stood, probe in hand, because probes are also radios when you need them to be. He sent help plus we plus border plus please to the alien with the urgency of a man who trusts everyone in the room to know the difference between drama and emergency. The bands flared, dimmed, and then the water around the pylons learned choreography. 3 aliens surfaced in a stagger that would have made music proud and held position just outside the polite line. The fishermen reached the break and began to untie knots that had tied themselves. Ray sent boat plus chair plus we plus host, which is to say, we will hold if you will push. The aliens pushed with pressure in a way that did not bruise, only persuaded. The floats stopped sawing and started listening. The banker took a rope and found out what his hands had been wanting. The lawyer shed his umbrella and took towels to men who would need them when the adrenaline debt came due. A journalist with sense filmed without commentary, thereby telling the truth for once on this coast. Cadenza raised the beacon to working light and moved ballast to keep the pier honest. Ray coordinated with nouns so small they were almost not words at all. The aliens made room. The sea admitted to being strong without having to be cruel. When it was over, the bay made the sound bays make when they approve of their inhabitants. Nothing. The floats behaved. The boats behaved. The rope agreed to be a noun instead of a metaphor. The fisherman whose funeral had not been photographed nodded once at the alien nearest him, a bow so respectful and so specific that a language could have been built on its bones. The alien brightened and dimmed once in the tone. Ray had learned for you did the right thing without us having to teach you, which is the best compliment in any grammar. They ate late, and the bread was the kind that keeps talking after you swallow it. The corporate steward filed his papers far away in a room that hated rope, and the papers would one day be framed and hung in a hallway that people would walk through on their way to jobs that did not hurt anyone, because boredom is contagious. The children returned to practice please and border and stop and help and host until their palms remembered without their brains getting in the way. That night, the ship mind dimmed its call sign to the color lighthouses use when telling themselves jokes. You will be asked to sign tomorrow, Cadenza said, voice small enough for bones. It will feel like a wedding and like a budget meeting and like sitting down in a chair that knows your weight. Ray looked at the slab with its 4 columns text, pressure, light, runes, and wished he had slept better as a boy. We will sign, he said, and then we will sweep. The lawyer smiled. The banker folded a towel like a man placing a hand on a friend's shoulder. The alien traced a line across the water like a poem learning to forgive rhyme. They signed at low tide because borders should be visible to the youngest eyes present. The station set the table it knew how to set, a mat that had learned to sit at the pool's lip. A slab with 4 columns, text, pressure, light, rooms, and a basket of bread that had been paid for with gardening instead of apologies. The fishermen tied their boats to etiquette and came ashore in pairs, as if weddings required witnesses, even when no paperwork was involved. The journalists were invited and told which verbs were not allowed. The saboteurs did not return because boredom had done its work. Cadenza tuned the pylons to warmth and dimmed the beacon until the world remembered itself. Ray stood where his knees could hear. The lawyer stood with the umbrella like a standard in parades that refuse uniforms. The banker held towels because treaties require logistics for tears. The ship mind spoke first, voice low enough for bones. "We are here to witness a room being furnished," Cadenza said. "We are here to remember where the chairs go and who chose them and why." He listed no titles and named no sovereigns because there were none to name. The aliens surfaced with the discretion of a host. The bands lit in bands that were not quite symmetrical, which is how you tell the room there is still time to change your mind. Ray sent please like a door held open. He sent host plus hold plus not own, and we plus carry plus enough. The bands brightened in a cadence. His slate had learned to call yes without being obnoxious about it. The disc lowered, and water learned shape around the probe. The pressure architecture from the other day, the one that had moved into the space in front of his sternum and refused to pay rent. He pressed back with a bowl rim cut as fine as a promise between neighbors. The pool rose. It did not spill. The lawyer read the first column as if reading were a sacrament. "We keep borders that move. We stop when asked. We ask before we put chairs in rooms that were here before us. When children are present, we slow down. No ownership of air, water, light, or pressure patterns. We host with food in silence. We schedule boredom. If you bring glitter to a covenant, you will sweep. We do not let sirens set our verbs. We make room for enough. Hosts leave room for guests to leave." The words did not sound like law because they had not been written to impress a judge. They sounded like chores. Men nodded. Women smiled. Children remembered. The second column pressure signed itself. Ray placed the probe at the pool center and let the alien write. The station's sensors translated duration and amplitude into a score, and then refused to convert it to anything vulgar like a waveform. The third column light followed, bands across the mantle in timed pulses that Cadenza recorded and replayed on the beacon, so that the station itself learned to nod. The fourth column rooms came last. Sketches on the slab that meant we will put a bench here and a water barrel there, and we will pledge shade for people who need to sit down without asking. "Witness," Cadenza said, and the fisherman with the unphotographed funeral stepped forward because he had decided to be the kind of man who gets publicly sentimental once before he dies. He placed his palm in the pool where the probe had warmed it for him, and did the bowl badly, and did please badly, and did we well. The alien wrote yes in patience. Ray exhaled for the first time that day. The banker laughed once, which was his new religion. The lawyer breathed in, breathed out, and held his umbrella like a man who had done a day's work and would be allowed to do it again tomorrow. The covenant asked for signatures next, but not the kind that stain. The children came to the mat in order of height, because humans cannot help ranking the world, even when we promise not to. They placed their hands in the water and did bowl and please, and border and stop and help. And the alien answered each with just enough light to be remembered by the part of the brain that wants to keep people alive. A grandmother who had once broken her thumb on a boat cleat and not forgiven the cleat did host perfectly on the second try and cried in a way that embarrassed nobody. At the end, Ray did what Cadenza had warned him he would be asked to do. He put both hands into the pool, left for host and right for hold, and he said in pressure what he could not say in air without losing ownership of it. "Stay with us," which did not mean forever, and did not mean you now have paperwork, and did not mean we own any part of your verbs. It meant this room has a chair that remembers your weight and will be glad to feel it again. The bands along the alien's mantle brightened in a pattern the slate refused to name. The disc touched his wrist just once, which was the right number. The journalists filmed and did not ruin it. The saboteurs filed a complaint in a city where the word witness was allergic to salt. The ship mind lifted its call sign to the precise brightness lighthouses use when a ship has found the entrance to a harbor on its own. The tide turned, as all decent endings require. Ray stood up slowly, so he would not make the pool regret having allowed him to have knees. The station logged the hour in 3 scripts and cut the file in the archive with a tag that meant you may play this in schools after it was not over. That is the trick with treaties that work. They generate chores. The fisherman argued gently about where to put the second bench. The gardeners asked if kelp could be coaxed into spelling please if you looked from the catwalk. The banker drafted boring letters to the city in a tone that would win, because boredom always wins eventually. The lawyer built a calendar of sweeping. The children ran the rope line back and forth and learned about cues. The alien stayed near the second reef and dimmed to the hue of hosts doing dishes. Cadenza sent the Covenant in 4 columns to 10 nodes. The cooperatives up the coast, the school where Ray had once embarrassed himself into becoming useful, the ship mind that patrolled the far channel and considered itself a connoisseur of chairs, the court that would be forced to admit paddles count as signatures now. The mind did not gloat. It is not considered elegant. There will be appeals, Cadenza said. There will be editorials. There will be weather. If we keep the rooms warm and the benches level, the rest will behave. Ray slept the way people sleep after choosing a piece of furniture that will outlast them. He dreamed of pressure shapes that had decided to adopt him. In the morning, he woke to find his hands were still the right size for bowls, and his knees had agreed to forgive him one more time. He walked the catwalk, and the pylons hummed good morning because he had signed their column too by not falling off them. The alien surfaced without ceremony, which is how deep friendships keep from being exhausted by anniversaries. They tested the Covenant the way rules should be tested, with festival. The cooperatives brought drums, and the ship mind played a tone the station could harmonize with. And as afternoon shaded to the blue hour, the bands along the aliens. Mantles spelled in light what the pressure had told Ray's bones the day before. Children did border, and then broke it to hand out bread, and then redrew it cheerfully, because lines that move are games, not prisons. The banker taught 3 toddlers how to sweep glitter that nobody had brought because he believed in vaccines. At dusk, a skiff approached with a family that had not come before because they had tired of watching city men pretend the sea is paperwork. They wore their best boots because respect is a language. The smallest child whispered, "Is the monster nice?" And the mother said, "The word for monster is adult," which was too sharp, but she could not help herself. The city had been mean. Ray knelt and showed the child the bowl and the please. The alien tasted the air and did a light that meant you may be seen safely. The child tried monster and pressure and accidentally said thunder. The alien approved of the mistake. When the moon rose in its parents' light, the ship mind made the lighthouse noise that means bedtime for grown-ups. Ray sat on the mat and put the probe away because sockets need to rest and so do men. The lawyer told a story about a court where a judge had once admitted the ocean is a person in the only sense that matters. It keeps receipts. The banker folded a towel smaller than physics and placed it where a hand would find it in the morning. The fisherman told the weather to take the night off. The alien dimmed to the shade of content plus watchfulness that parents and minds use when thresholds are near. Ray thought about the word he had been given and how some words change the size of your chest without anyone needing to measure it. He thought of the steward who had offered to standardize and how sometimes standardization is just fear of small rooms. He thought of the next bay where boats would forget borders and the next mind who would have to learn this tone of humor. He thought of the children practicing please with their hands until the sea agreed to remember their names. He thought of furniture. He thought of bread. He thought of how treaties are not laws that win. They are habits that get good at not losing. Tomorrow, Cadenza said, because minds believe in tomorrow with a stubbornness that embarrasses empires. We install the second bench. We show the co-ops how to print the pressure column on plastic you can throw at weather. We teach the drone pilots shame. Ray laughed because that last one had the right amount of ambition. The alien brushed his wrist with a frond and made a micro eddy that tasted like mockery and parental fondness. He said yes, and the pool rose and fell with the dignity of a room that had learned its chairs. There would be appeals. There would be editorials. There would be weather. There would be toddlers who said thunder when they meant monster and got away with it. There would be stewards who returned with different logos and identical shoes. There would be lawyers who got to be useful without having to be loud, and bankers who kept towels where souls can find them, and ship minds who remembered how bright to be when a boat hesitated. Language would go on doing its untidy work of letting people stay. Treaties would go on refusing to be finished. Ray would keep his knees ready. The alien would keep its bands bright enough in the right places. The sea would keep receipts, and the station would keep the lights just high enough to make rooms, and not so high that stars forgot they had jobs.